I want you to picture a client invoice showing 14 hours of billed legal work on a single day, research, drafting, a client call, all performed, according to the timesheet, by a managing partner who was, according to his own calendar and a set of international flight records, on a beach in Portugal at the time, 3,000 miles away from his office and entirely unreachable by phone for most of that day. That's not a billing error. That's fiction. Invoiced at $1,100 an hour. This is the story of Sophia Marchetti, the billing compliance analyst who found that calendar and who very nearly lost her job for noticing it before she had the proof to back it up. Sophia Marchetti was 30 years old, and she'd worked as a billing compliance analyst at Harlan & Voss, a mid-sized corporate law firm with offices in 2 cities, for just under 3 years. Her job existed because law firms live and die by something called the billable hour. Every minute an attorney spends on a client matter gets logged, categorized, and eventually invoiced, often at rates running from $300 to well over $1,000 an hour, depending on seniority. Getting that process right isn't just good practice, it's the entire revenue model of the firm, and it's also, when it goes wrong, one of the fastest ways for a law firm to end up in front of a state bar disciplinary committee. Sophia's specific role was to audit timesheets before they became client invoices, checking for duplicate entries, verifying that billed hours matched actual calendar activity where that was traceable, and flagging anything that looked inconsistent before it went out the door with the firm's name attached to it. It's meticulous, unglamorous work in an industry that otherwise runs on prestige and long titles, and doing it well means almost nobody at the firm ever thinks about you at all. The firm's managing partner was a man named Marcus Reyes, 52, 25 years at Harlan & Voss, the kind of rainmaker partner whose name alone brought in enough client relationships that nobody above him ever seriously questioned how he ran his own practice group. He billed more hours than almost anyone else at the firm, which, in an industry that measures value almost entirely in billable output, made him close to untouchable. Sophia's first 18 months, she had no particular reason to look closely at Marcus's timesheets specifically. Corporate litigation is genuinely unpredictable. Hours swing wildly depending on deadlines, filings, depositions, and the general chaos of active cases, and partners at his level often bill more hours than junior associates simply because they're pulled onto more matters simultaneously. A certain amount of apparent irregularity in a senior partner's billing is just the nature of the work. If anything, Sophia had genuinely respected Marcus during those early months in the ordinary way junior staff respect a partner who seems to actually deserve his reputation. He was famously responsive. Clients said he answered emails at any hour, showed up personally for depositions other partners at his level would have delegated, and had built a client roster that, on paper, made him one of the most valuable people at the firm. None of that struck Sophia as an act at the time, which was, in retrospect, exactly what made the later discovery so difficult to reconcile with everything she thought she'd understood about how he actually operated. It was in her second year that she noticed something during a routine reconciliation that didn't fit even that generous tolerance. 2 separate client matters, both active the same week, both billed for what appeared to be Marcus's personal attention on the same afternoon, 4 hours of drafting logged to one client, 3.5 hours of what the entry called strategic review logged to a second, entirely unrelated client, both time-stamped for roughly the same 3-hour window. It's the kind of overlap that happens sometimes in a legitimate way. A partner genuinely can toggle between 2 matters in a single afternoon, working in shorter bursts on each. Sophia flagged it as a routine reconciliation question rather than an accusation, the same low-key correction request she sent dozens of times a month for far more mundane reasons. Marcus's assistant responded on his behalf within the hour, with an explanation that was plausible enough on its face. Mr. Reyes worked on both matters that afternoon in overlapping sessions, common for his caseload. Timesheet reflects total time attributed across concurrent work, per firm policy on complex multi-matter days. It was worded carefully enough and confidently enough that Sophia let it go, filing it exactly the way she filed 100 similar borderline explanations every year. But roughly 2 months later, she found a second instance that was harder to wave away with the same logic. a client matter billed for 6 hours of Marcus's time on a specific Tuesday, research, drafting, and a client call, all logged under his name, fell on a date Sophia happened to remember specifically, because the firm's internal calendar, which she had routine access to for scheduling conflict checks, showed Marcus out of office that entire week for a previously announced vacation. She didn't flag this one through the normal correction channel. Something about the pattern from 2 months earlier made her hesitant to simply ask again and receive another confident, unfalsifiable explanation. Instead, she quietly pulled the firm's internal calendar entries for the past year, cross-referencing every day Marcus had logged as out of office, on vacation or traveling, against every timesheet entry billed under his name during those same windows. The pattern, once she'd built it out, was substantial. Across the previous 14 months, she found 19 separate days where Marcus had billed client hours, sometimes just an hour or two, sometimes a full day's worth, while the firm's own internal calendar showed him explicitly marked as unavailable, out of office, or traveling internationally. She still didn't have hard proof beyond an internal scheduling calendar, which, she reasoned honestly, could in theory simply be outdated or not perfectly maintained. Executives update their own calendars imperfectly all the time, and she knew that assuming fraud from a calendar discrepancy alone would be exactly the kind of overreach that could get her question dismissed instantly, or worse, get her labeled as someone recklessly accusing a top partner without adequate grounds. So she looked for something harder to explain away with an imperfectly maintained calendar. She started cross-referencing the specific vacation dates against the firm's corporate travel booking system, which she also had limited access to for expense reconciliation purposes, flight confirmations, hotel bookings under the firm's travel account, in some cases even corporate credit card charges for meals and incidentals in cities thousands of miles from the office, all of it matching, date for date, the same day's billed hours had gone out under his name. The clearest single instance was the Portugal trip, 14 billed hours across 2 matters on a specific date, matched against a booked and confirmed 10-day vacation in the Algarve, flight records showing him departing 4 days before the billed date and returning 3 days after it. There was no plausible version of that day where Marcus Reyes was performing legal work from a beach resort 3,000 miles and 5 time zones away, at least not 14 hours of it, on top of whatever an actual vacation involves. She calculated the broader pattern once she'd confirmed enough individual instances to trust the total. Across roughly 14 months, 19 flagged days, an average of just under 6 billed hours per flagged day, at Marcus's standard rate of $1,100 an hour. The total came to just over $1.4 million in apparently fabricated billing, and that was before she even considered whether similar fabrication might exist on days that didn't happen to fall during a clearly documented vacation, which would be far harder to prove at all. There was one afternoon, about 3 weeks into this quiet cross-referencing, when Marcus's assistant stopped by Sophia's desk to ask a routine scheduling question and glanced, in passing, at the spreadsheet open on her second monitor, a column of dates next to a column of calendar entries. Nothing overtly labeled, but close enough that Sophia felt her stomach drop for a moment. "Working on the quarterly reconciliation audit," Sophia said, which was, strictly speaking, true in the broadest possible sense. The assistant nodded, uninterested, and moved on with her actual question. Sophia sat very still for a moment after she left, aware of how easily that could have gone differently, and made a point after that of only working on the file at home, on her own laptop, rather than risking it appearing on a firm-owned monitor again. Around that same period, she mentioned the situation in careful generalities to a friend from law school who'd gone into in-house compliance work rather than private practice, someone who understood professional ethics obligations well enough to give useful perspective without needing specifics. If this is what you think it is, you need to understand the calculus is different in a law firm than almost anywhere else, her friend told her over the phone. Billing fraud isn't just an internal HR problem here. It's a bar disciplinary issue. Which means the moment you can prove it, The firm has an actual legal obligation to report it, whether they want to or not. That protects you more than it would in a normal company. But it also means you need airtight documentation, because a bar investigation will scrutinize your evidence as hard as it scrutinizes his conduct. Sophia carried that distinction with her for the rest of the process, and it shaped, more than anything else, how carefully she separated what she could prove from what she merely suspected. Sophia sat with that number for several days before deciding what to do with it, because she understood with complete clarity what she was actually looking at. This wasn't an internal financial irregularity contained to the firm's own books, the way a padded expense report might be. This was fraudulent billing sent directly to paying clients, real corporations being charged real money for legal work that had, according to the strongest evidence she could find, never actually happened. That crosses from an internal compliance problem into something state bar associations exist specifically to discipline, sometimes severely, because client trust and billing integrity is close to the entire foundation of the legal profession's credibility. Before she could finish building her case properly, the situation accelerated in a direction she hadn't anticipated. One of the firm's larger corporate clients flagged an internal audit discrepancy of their own. Their in-house counsel had noticed an invoice referencing a strategy call with Marcus on a date that, according to their own meeting records, that call had never actually taken place. The client's general counsel called Harlan & Voss's billing department directly. Not accusatory exactly, but pointed in the specific way in-house lawyers get when a number on an invoice doesn't match their own records, and they want an explanation before approving payment. The inquiry landed, within the normal course of business, on Sophia's desk for investigation, the same way any billing discrepancy from a major client would. Sophia recognized the date immediately, because it was one of the 19 she'd already flagged in her own private file weeks earlier, a day the internal calendar showed Marcus traveling for an entirely unrelated matter. She now had independent, external confirmation of exactly the kind of discrepancy she'd been quietly building a case around, arriving through a channel she hadn't created and couldn't be accused of manufacturing. Marcus, upon learning a client had raised a billing question, moved first and moved fast. He went to the firm's chief operating officer directly, framing the client's complaint as evidence of a systemic problem in Sophia's department, suggesting her team's billing reconciliation process had introduced errors into client invoices, and that given the size and importance of this particular client relationship, it might be time to consider whether Sophia's role needed additional oversight. A phrase that, in the specific corporate dialect Sophia had learned to recognize over 3 years, meant exactly what it sounded like it meant. She was called into a meeting the following Monday, ostensibly to discuss the client's billing complaint, and found Marcus already in the room alongside the COO when she arrived. A seating arrangement that made unmistakably clear whose version of events had already gotten a head start. "I want to be direct," Marcus said, before Sophia had even finished sitting down. "This client relationship is one of our most important, and I take it very seriously when their trust in our billing accuracy gets called into question. I don't think this is personal, Sophia, but someone has to own what went out under the firm's name, and right now the trail points to your department's reconciliation process." Sophia understood, in that exact moment, that the file she had been building carefully and quietly for weeks was no longer something she had the luxury of finishing on her own timeline. It was the only thing standing between her and a formal performance issue being opened against her for a fraud she hadn't committed, initiated by the person who actually had. She felt something very close to panic for the first few seconds, sitting across from 2 people with far more institutional power than she had, listening to an explanation constructed specifically to make her the story instead of him. But she also recognized, underneath the panic, the same steadying instinct that had gotten her this far in the first place, that the actual facts, once she could lay them out cleanly, didn't care whose office was bigger or whose name brought in more revenue. "I take billing accuracy seriously too," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'd like the chance to review the specific invoice in question and provide a full written response before any conclusions get drawn about where the process broke down. The COO, to his credit, agreed, somewhat reluctantly given Marcus's evident urgency to close the matter quickly, and gave her 48 hours. She asked for that same window to finish the file she'd been building for weeks, now with real-time pressure bearing down on her. She organized it with even more care than she might have under less urgent circumstances, precisely because she understood the stakes had changed. She led with the specific client complaint that had triggered this meeting, the phantom strategy call, and matched it directly against Marcus's calendar and travel records for that exact date, which placed him, again, out of the office on a different trip entirely. Then she laid out the broader pattern. 19 flagged days across 14 months, cross-referenced against internal calendars, travel bookings, and corporate card records, totaling just over $1.4 million in questionable billing. She was explicit throughout about the limits of absolute certainty in a few of the murkier cases, while being completely unambiguous about the ones, like Portugal, that admitted no other reasonable explanation. Rather than bringing this file back to the same COO who just sat across from Marcus, accepting his framing at face value, Sophia requested an emergency meeting with the firm's general counsel, a position that existed specifically to handle exactly this category of professional and ethical exposure, and whose obligations ran to the firm's licensing integrity rather than to any individual partner's comfort. She sent one message: "I have documentation of a billing pattern involving fabricated client hours that I believe creates serious bar disciplinary exposure for the firm. This is time-sensitive, given an active client complaint. I need 30 minutes today." The general counsel, a woman named Patricia Alvarado, cleared her calendar within the hour. Sophia laid out the file precisely, starting with the specific client complaint, since it was the most immediate and undeniable thread, then widening out to the full 14-month pattern. She was careful, throughout, to frame every claim at exactly the level of certainty the evidence actually supported. "I want to be completely clear about what I can prove versus what I'm inferring. I can prove these specific billed hours don't match calendar and travel records. I cannot prove intent beyond what the pattern itself suggests. I think that determination needs to sit with people who have both the authority and the ethical obligation to make it." Patricia read through the file slowly, asking pointed questions about how each cross-reference had been built and whether anyone else could access the same records to verify them independently. When she reached the Portugal example, she looked up. "This is unambiguous. There's no version of this where he's doing legal work from that location on that date." "That's the one I'd stake everything on," Sophia said. "The rest builds a pattern around it. You did exactly the right thing bringing this to me instead of trying to defend yourself to Marcus and the COO directly," Patricia said, closing the file. "I need you to say nothing further about the client's original complaint until I've had a chance to review this properly. That protects you as much as it protects the investigation. What happened over the following days moved with the urgency that active client-facing billing fraud allegation typically demands in a law firm, given the direct bar disciplinary exposure involved." Patricia brought in outside ethics counsel the same afternoon. A broader audit of Marcus's billing across his full client roster, not just the 14 months Sophia had visibility into, was authorized within 2 days. It found additional discrepancies stretching back nearly 4 years, once investigators knew specifically what pattern to look for and had authority to pull records Sophia herself had never had access to. The outside auditors also found something Sophia hadn't been positioned to uncover on her own: a secondary pattern where certain fabricated hours had been deliberately split across 2 different client matter codes, rather than billed entirely to one client, apparently to keep any single invoice's anomaly small enough to avoid drawing attention during normal client-side budget review. It was a more sophisticated version of exactly what she'd first noticed with the overlapping 4-hour and 3.5-hour entries 2 years earlier. The very discrepancy Marcus's assistant had explained away as ordinary multi-matter overlap. It hadn't been ordinary at all. It had been the method, refined and repeated for years before Sophia ever noticed the first crack in it. Marcus Reyes was placed on immediate administrative suspension, pending both an internal disciplinary process and a mandatory self-report to the state bar, which Harlan and Voss's ethics counsel advised was legally required given the scope of confirmed client billing fraud. The self-report and subsequent bar investigation over the following year resulted in Marcus's law license being suspended for a period long enough to effectively end his active practice, alongside a substantial restitution obligation to the affected clients, negotiated separately from the disciplina proceeding itself. The firm proactively refunded the affected clients for every dollar of confirmed fraudulent billing across the full 4-year window the expanded audit eventually covered, a decision Patricia pushed for. Specifically because voluntary, complete restitution before any client had to formally demand, it was, in her professional judgment, the only path that preserved the firm's own standing with both its clients and the bar. Sophia was not, in the end, disciplined for the reconciliation issue Marcus had tried to pin on her. Quite the opposite. Patricia made a point of documenting, in writing to the firm's executive committee, that the entire matter had only surfaced because one analyst had trusted a calendar discrepancy over a confident partner's explanation, and had done so carefully enough that the resulting case was clean, well documented, and immediately actionable, rather than a messy accusation that could have been picked apart. She was promoted into a newly created Director of Billing Integrity role, reporting directly to the General Counsel's office, rather than through the firm's normal partner-driven operation structure, with expanded authority to cross-reference any partner's billing against calendar and travel data on a routine, unannounced basis. A structural change made explicitly because the entire scheme had only been possible due to one partner's billing, existing largely outside any independent verification layer, protected by seniority and revenue rather than by anything resembling actual oversight. Some months later, training a new billing analyst on the updated reconciliation process, Sophia found herself explaining why a senior partner's billable hours now got checked with the same rigor as a first-year associate's. "Seniority isn't evidence that something is true," she said. "For 14 months at least, one of our most respected partners billed clients for work that provably never happened, and it took a client complaint and a lot of luck for anyone to look closely enough to catch it. The rule now is simple. Every hour billed to a client should be able to survive being checked against something outside the person who logged it. If it can't, it doesn't go out the door, no matter whose name is on it." She still runs her own periodic cross-reference on billing patterns across the firm, a habit that started as quiet, anxious due diligence and became, over time, simply her actual job description. She says, when people ask her about it now, that the hardest part was never actually finding the pattern. Calendars and flight records either match a billed hour or they don't, and if you're patient enough to check, they eventually tell you the truth. The hardest part was the week she spent believing she might lose her own job over someone else's fraud, before she had enough proof to make the truth undeniable to anyone else. A few months into her new role, training an incoming billing analyst on the revised reconciliation process, Sophia found herself explaining why every partner's hours now got cross-checked against outside calendar and travel data as a matter of routine, rather than only when a client happened to notice something wrong. One of the new hires asked, reasonably, whether that level of scrutiny wasn't somewhat insulting to apply to partners who'd spent decades building spotless reputations. "It's not about insulting anyone," Sophia said. "For 4 years, one of the most respected people at this firm billed clients for work that provably never happened, and the only reason it stopped is that a routine calendar check didn't match a routine invoice, and someone was stubborn enough to keep looking instead of accepting the first explanation. Reputation tells you what people are willing to believe about someone. It doesn't tell you what actually happened on a given Tuesday. Only the records can tell you that, and our job now is to let them, every time, regardless of whose name is attached, AD." It turned out the truth was on her side. It usually is, if you're patient enough and careful enough to let the records speak before you do. If you've ever been blamed for a problem someone more senior than you actually caused, and felt the ground shift under your own career because of it, keep building your case anyway, quietly and carefully, even when it feels like the accusation against you is moving faster than your proof. The records don't care about seniority. They only care about what actually happened. Keep your file. Keep your receipts. The calendar always knows exactly where everyone really was.